Good morning, everybody. My name is Traci Underwood. Oh, sorry for the technical difficulties already. Okay. My name is Traci Underwood, and I work for the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I wanted to say good morning and welcome to the webinar, Parenting and Surviving on Welfare. We have a lot of people signed up and not that many people on. I see people are coming on frantically right now. So I'm going to give everybody about 2 more minutes, so hang tight, and then we will get started. Good morning again, everybody. For those of you who were coming on when I made my first little hello, my name is Traci Underwood, and I work for the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And you're signed on to a webinar called Parenting and Surviving on Welfare. We're talking about the domestic violence protections and policies and things that are available for folks who are navigating the welfare system. So if you're in the wrong place, now's the time to, but I'm pretty exciting, so this could be good information, even if you're in the wrong place. Maybe you'll learn something new. Oh, good. Technical difficulties are gone. This is our agenda for this morning. We'll do a welcome, and I'll introduce myself, and my colleague will introduce herself. We're not going to introduce all of you because there's a lot of you. So sorry about that, but we don't have time for that. We will talk a little bit about domestic violence statistics. That's what DV stands for, if you see that, or if I say that today. We say DV, we mean domestic violence. The family violence option we're going to talk about, and that's the thing that allows for all the different policies and protections for folks surviving domestic violence who are accessing TANF or accessing welfare. We will talk about confidentiality, dig into some of the policies that I think you might help you think about how you do your jobs and how you work with families, about the impact of, the impact of the TANF policies on domestic violence survivors. And then we'll talk a little bit about resources and wrap it up. Throughout, we will have time for questions. So here's a little, so right now we'll do a little housekeeping, a little tour of your control panel here. It's best if you listen through your computer speakers. So remember to unmute your speakers. But But if that's not working, you can listen by phone. If you need to switch that, you can click on to telephone. But if you're hearing me just fine, then you can stick with your computer speakers. Everybody's on mute because there's so many of us. So please use the question box to communicate, and it's circled there. You can see the question box. You enter a question, it comes up for us, and we will be able to respond. We may not respond right away, but go ahead and anytime you have that question, before you forget it, jot it down into the questions box. And we have certain times throughout this presentation where we'll be stopping for questions and comments and discussion, and we'll address your questions at that time. If your computer has a built-in microphone or you're listening by telephone, you can also use the raise your hand button, and we can unmute you to ask a question. So if you have something that during the question and answer times, if it was a complicated question that you couldn't type out or didn't want to take the time to do that, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you during those specific question and answer times. All right, if your control panel minimizes and goes to the side of your screen, you can click that little orange arrow that's circled here to get it back. Don't panic, it's there. All right, and here we are, your hosts. I'm Traci Underwood, like I said, and there's my contact information. I think, Lee, are we going to be able to get them a copy of the PowerPoint after?
We can, and we have it record, and we're going to record this webinar.
Okay, and we're recording this webinar, so you'll have our contact information in that way, or you can jot it down now if you'd like. There's my email and my phone number. I coordinate the Economic Justice Project here at the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So a lot of my work has to do with welfare. I work a lot with DSHS, with the TANF program, thinking about policies and how they affect survivors of domestic violence, which is why I'm talking to you today. And Lee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lee Hoffheimer. I'm with as you know, with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I think I've met many of you, maybe I've met quite a few of you over the past year and a half. I've been part of the team doing training around domestic violence and that screening and using the Futures About Violence tools and some of the safety planning.
Cool. So Lee is here, and Lee is going to be sort of womaning the questions box. And so she might be able to respond even if you have some just technical questions or little questions that don't have to do with the material. You can put those into the questions box as well, and she'll be able to address those. And then she'll also be able to address some of the bigger questions as well as we go through. All right, before we dig in, I wanted to talk a little bit about the language I'm going to be using, because some people find it confusing if you don't work in this field of domestic violence and anti-violence that we work in. People look at me with blank stares sometimes when I talk to them. So I don't want that to happen. Not that I can see you, so you could be blank staring at me and I wouldn't know. But I want to talk about how I talk about domestic violence. And I want to address gender first. I often talk about domestic violence when I use examples. I'll often talk about a survivor, a person who has experienced the violence. I'll often use female pronouns. And when I talk about perpetrators or abusers, somebody who's using violence, I will often use male pronouns. And that is to reflect the statistics that we have that show that most survivors are women and most abusers are men. However, that does not mean that it doesn't happen the other way around. It doesn't mean that men don't abuse. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in same-sex relationships, because it does at the same rate that it happens in heterosexual relationships. But I talk about it in the way that I do because of the statistics that I just mentioned. But I want to recognize that it can happen. Women can abuse men, and it absolutely happens in same-sex relationships as well. The term survivor and victim, I've already used the term survivor like 10 times already since I've been talking to you this morning. I use the term survivor to mean a person who is experiencing or has experienced domestic violence, family violence, intimate partner violence. There's a lot of different ways to call that. But I use the term survivor rather than victim most of the time. And that's to reflect the fact that I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've worked with a lot of survivors. I haven't ever met one that said, please refer to me as a victim. And there might be some out there, but the vast majority of the folks who have experienced violence from an intimate partner in their lives, who I have come into contact with, and the many advocates that I've worked with have come into contact with, really prefer the term survivor. It's a more empowering term, and it reflects what they're doing every day, which is surviving. So that's why I use that term, and that's what I mean when I say survivor rather than victim. I do want to point out that that doesn't mean there aren't true victims. People do die because of domestic violence, and survivors continue to be victimized oftentimes by their abuser because of domestic violence. So it's not to diminish the fact that victimization happens. And then the term domestic violence is, defined in a lot of different ways. By a lot of different systems and fields. What we're talking about today is mostly intimate partner violence, so abuse that's happening within a relationship. And what we mean by that is when somebody's experiencing domestic violence in their relationship, it means that one partner has power and control over another partner. That's the basics of it. And I'm sure if y'all have been talking to Lee, I'm sure you've gotten the lowdown on most of that stuff. If you have questions about that, please put them in the questions box. I can elaborate. But really, we're mostly talking about today is intimate partner violence when one partner has power and control over the other partner. I want to talk a little bit about the prevalence of domestic violence because it is prevalent, unfortunately. About 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men report experiencing intimate partner violence in their lifetime. That's a lot. That's a lot. And that statistic comes from a survey that the CDC does regularly about intimate partner violence, about violence in relationships. And the next statistic is based on a collection of different research articles and academic research. And it says that national research shows domestic violence survivors account for 50 to 60% of the TANF caseload. And that is similar to the first bullet point, that's in a person's lifetime. So it might not be that the person on TANF, which is welfare, we'll get into the acronyms in a minute. Sorry, I realized that I'm using one before we talked about it, but TANF is Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. You probably already know that. Some people just refer to that as welfare, but it's cash assistance. And 50 to 60% of the folks on TANF caseload have experienced domestic violence at some point in their lives. And you might notice that's higher. It's a little higher than the first bullet point, which is just a general statistic for the general population. And that's not because people who are living in poverty are more violent, but it really reflects the fact that when you don't have money and resources, it's a lot harder to stay safe. You have fewer options. It's harder to get out of an abusive relationship or stay safe while you want to try and stay in that abusive relationship or make that relationship better. It's very hard when you don't have money and resources to stay safe. And that number really reflects that. A few more statistics. This is from, just one day in Washington State. So this is a snapshot of one day. And it comes from the National Network to End Domestic Violence's report. It's a national census of domestic violence services. And this is 54 local domestic violence advocacy programs in Washington State participated in this. And these are the numbers that we got. So a little over 2,000 domestic violence victims and children received services from domestic violence programs. 837 calls to domestic violence hotlines were answered. 391 individuals were educated on domestic violence by local programs. 382 requests from domestic violence victims were turned down because programs didn't have the resources to provide them. And that's things like emergency shelter, housing, childcare, transportation, and legal representation, which can be a big one. And really the vast majority of unmet needs were for shelter or housing advocacy to keep victims, to help victims get or keep safe housing. And this is something that just continues to be a challenge. And I bet there's some nodding heads out there because I'm sure the folks that you work with and that you visit struggle with this as well. It's just a big issue. Are there any questions or comments so far about all this data? Nothing. All right. Don't be shy. I'm happy to answer questions. Any hands raised? I'm looking. I don't see any hands raised either. So now's the time if you didn't want to type anything, but you want to see if I can unmute you if you have a speaker. Okay. We will keep moving. Alphabet soup. Now, this is the sort of the jumping into the nitty-gritty of TANF, of the program, of policies. I already talked about TANF and what that stands for, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. For those of you who have been doing this work for a while, you may remember prior to 1996, it was called AFDC, which is, and it's similar, it was a cash assistance program. But it was not a welfare to work program, and that's what it is now. So TANF, after Clinton and welfare reform came TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And the program is a welfare to work program, which means that you don't just qualify for cash assistance if you meet a certain income level, like you did with AFDC. Now you have to meet income, you have to be under a certain income level and resource level. So there's a financial eligibility you have to meet, but you also have to participate. You have to do things that the Work First program, which is what our TANF program in Washington State is called. It's called Work First. You have to do things that Work First says is things that are appropriate to participate. Mostly that's job search, but that could be a lot of different things depending on the family's barriers, and we're going to dig into what that means for domestic violence survivors throughout this webinar. But that's what TANF is. Who knows? I'm not going to go through every single one of these acronyms, but I want to hit the ones that we're definitely going to be hitting when we talk today. Who knows what CSO stands for? If you do, just type it in really quick or raise your hand. Any?
One person.
Yep. Ah, yes, Erin. Community Services Office. Yes. Ding, 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 ding. Too bad we're not in a real training because I would be throwing you chocolate right now, Erin, but sorry. Maybe if you have chocolate there, you can treat yourself. But Community Services Office. So this is the welfare office. This is what, so I will be saying this throughout, and I want to make sure people know what I'm talking about. If I say the CSO, that's the place you go to get your cash assistance, to, interview for TANF, to, go and see about food stamps, things like Social Security, all of those things there. So I guess we could, that's what SSI and SSDI are, Social Security, Disability, and Supplemental Security Insurance. Those are programs that if you're disabled, you may be able to get. SSDI is a state program. It's a little easier to get on for cash assistance. SSI is a federal program, and it's much harder to get enrolled in. But those things you can also do at the Community Services Office, at the CSO. Pretty much anything that has to do with cash assistance or food, you can deal with there. What about CE? Does anybody know what the CE stands for? if you've heard people refer to the CE. You can type it in or raise your hand. Nobody? All right, the CE is comprehensive evaluation. You might hear about, if you're working with families on TANF or getting onto TANF, you might hear about this. You might hear some complaints about this. The comprehensive evaluation, you know, there's some good things and some bad things about that. It's about, it's the interview that they have to go through that helps identify the barriers that they might be facing, and that helps them create their IRP, which is on here, and that's my next question I'm going to ask you what that stands for. But it helps them create the plan that they have to follow. That's the welfare to work piece of TANF. It's the things that they have to participate in, and this comprehensive evaluation helps them. It's a giant, it can take more than one day. In fact, like if the person doesn't even have enough time to sit and do the whole thing, it takes hours to complete. And it's in it, they figure out if they have mental health concerns, if they're dealing with chemical dependency, and domestic violence is a piece of this comprehensive evaluation as well. It's a bit of a bear, but it does, you know, if folks are able to be present for it and are willing to disclose some information, it does help the worker figure out if there are resources in the community that they can offer, which can be good. So IRP, what's an IRP stand for? Anybody know what that was? That one is? Yes, Nina, Individual Responsibility Plan. Ding, ding, ding. Very good. So that is the plan that's created after the CE, after this comprehensive evaluation. And that's the thing that's got the activities that they usually call them activities that a parent on TANF has to participate in. So they have to do the things that are on this plan that they say they're going to do in order to continue to get their TANF grant. If they don't do those things, sanction happens. We're going to talk about that later. But that is what that means. Individual responsibility plan. So if you're working with someone on TANF, that's the thing that they're going to be following. And that's the thing that they can include domestic violence related activities that help somebody, you know, deal with the abuse that they might be experiencing. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. All right, I think that's all of the, oh, and the last thing I want to talk about, because that's the next thing we're going to, is the FVO. I said it earlier in our agenda. I don't know if anybody remembers what that stands for. Does anybody remember what FVO stands for? Oh, it's family violence option. The family violence option. And so we will go on to that in just a second. What, oh, are there questions? There seem to be questions. Let's see.
So we've got
Lee.
two.
Yeah.
So one question, Tracy, when you gave the 50 to 60% state for TANF caseload, does that include those abused as children?
It includes anyone who's identified as experiencing family violence. So it depends on, so it's a nationwide statistic. So that depends on how the different states identify domestic violence, but it could include that if folks are disclosing that they experienced family violence as a child, now as grown-ups. But it's an adult statistic, so it's not including children in that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, we're going to wait on the other questions. We will get to your questions for sure, but thank you for bringing that up because that was about the statistics earlier. The Work First orientation is happening now. That's a new thing. And, you know, we didn't know how it was going to go, but I think from what I hear from the department and from advocates who are working with survivors on TANF, it's going pretty well. Everybody has to complete an orientation before they can get their TANF grant, which is what we were concerned about when we were advocating, when the coalition was advocating around, you know, making sure that there were protections if people couldn't get to the CSO, or if it wasn't safe to travel to the CSO because of they were being stalked or whatnot. You know, we wanted to make sure they were still able to get their TANF grant. And it looks like they have been able to. So if somebody is not able to get to the CSO because and do this work first orientation because of domestic violence, because of their safety situation, they can do an individual orientation over the phone with their worker. That's something that they can request. Most of the time, though, folks can get there, and the orientations are offered daily at least, and sometimes more in most of the CSOs around the state. So it'd be good to know if that's the case for your particular CSO, know when the orientations happen. They're usually, at specifically scheduled times. It's like 10 o'clock every day orientation. But that's really great. And during that orientation, they are given information that, they're given a stack of paperwork, right? Or when you do it online, it's just like page after page, it's the application. Sometimes you're not going to catch everything, especially if somebody's in crisis dealing with domestic violence situation. You're not going to catch all the details. And what the orientation does is it, puts you in front of an actual human being who's telling you some of those important details, including things about the protections offered around domestic violence. So that's really great. The family violence option. So this is the thing that all of the policies at DSHS, at the CSO are, and in the Work First program are modeled on. This is a federal law, and I've referenced it up there. It's Public Law 104-193. There's the section if you want to look it up yourself. But this is essentially what it says. It asks states who adopt it, and at this point, all 50 states have adopted it. States who adopt it must do these three things. Their TANF program must do these three things. They have to screen and identify individuals receiving assistance, about whether or not they're experiencing domestic violence. They have to refer anybody who discloses, who says, yeah, actually that's going on for me. They have to refer them to counseling and supportive services. And the third one is the biggie. They have to waive other program requirements such as time limits, residency requirements, child support cooperation, family cap provisions, and those are just suggestions. It's not an exhaustive list. In cases where complying with those requirements would make it more difficult for parents receiving assistance to escape domestic violence, or would unfairly penalize them for being a victim of domestic violence, or if it would put individuals at further risk of domestic violence. So basically, if it's going to make the violence you're experiencing worse, or if it just unfairly penalizes you for the domestic violence you've been experiencing, you can waive program requirements. And that means things like job search, other things that on the IRB, not just these that were listed around child support cooperation and time limits. So the screening for domestic violence, this is from the Work First Handbook, and it's referenced there at the bottom. If you ever have a question, the Work First Handbook is online. It's on dshs.wa.gov. I always just search for manuals in the search box, and it comes up. It's one of the choices. And it's handy because it's got all the rules that folks that are working in the Work First program are following, or hopefully following. So they have to screen at an initial intake, and that happens in the comprehensive evaluation, the CE. They also are supposed to screen for domestic violence once a year, also before a case can be placed in sanction, during a time limit extension analysis. And we'll talk more about sanction and time limit extension in a few minutes. And really at any point that they have contact with somebody and they think, what you're telling me, I've got some red flags happening. Like, I feel like I want to dig a little deeper about what might be actually going on for you, because we have resources we can offer if you are experiencing domestic violence. So really at any time they can screen. And they have specific screening questions that are in the CE that help somebody figure out if domestic violence is going on. And they go beyond the general, like, physical violence stuff. They talk about economic manipulation and coercion. They talk about, generally just feeling safe at home, if there are consequences, if they are able to control their own money, things like that. So they go deeper than just, is your partner hitting you? Because that's really, most of the time that's not happening in domestic violence situations. Most of the time, the violence is a lot more manipulative and insidious, and harder to see. And context is key when hoping that someone might disclose domestic violence with their DSHS worker, with their CSO worker. Because really, like, who really wants to talk about domestic violence when, if they're having issues with their relationship, when they're there to get their TANF check, right? Like, they don't want to say anything wrong. They just want to, like, get the check. I don't want to, so many times survivors don't disclose that they're experiencing domestic violence, and they don't understand that it might be beneficial if they do. They don't really understand that. And so this is the paragraph that workers are supposed to read before they do the screening, so that they give folks a little bit of context about why they're asking these really intimate personal questions and why it might be beneficial to say if it is something they're experiencing. So I'm not going to read all of this. You can read it. But the first idea is that just normalizing it, saying we ask these questions for everyone. It happens a lot, which is why we ask. There's no right answers, and it doesn't affect your eligibility. The second idea is that, if you let me know that it's an issue, we can create a plan that works for you and offer community resources. So, like, there might be something practical that we can do on this end that could be beneficial. You can answer these questions today or let us know anytime, and we can change your plan. That's something that, people, if they are feeling nervous, they can say, okay, well, I can just think about this and mull this over and then come back to them later if I need to. Any information you give about family violence will be kept confidential in our computer systems. Please let us know if you have concerns about anyone accessing this information. And we put this in here because most people aren't going to have an issue, but every year I hear from a few advocates that a few survivors have, disclosed domestic violence, and they thought it was confidential because in their heads confidential means just between them and their worker, and they didn't understand that people at different offices, different CSOs, could potentially access that information. But the reality is that thousands of people can see that information, and if somebody wants to, if somebody has an abuser whose mom works across the state for, the Work First program, works at a different CSO or whatnot, that person can potentially access the case. Even though they're not supposed to, they can. And that happens, unfortunately. And so that's why we put that in here, so that survivors can understand that, yes, we have confidentiality rules, but it does mean that it goes into our computer system. Lots of people can see it. And then the last bullet point is, of course, about Child Protective Services and being mandated reporters. All right. So that's the screening portion of what we do. Oh, and it looks like there's a question. Let's stop for a question.
So I'm just going to read this question.
Okay.
So Tom Berry says, when you talk about how long the CE may take, please note what's positive about it, that for example, division into parts and the ability to postpone completion until urgent needs are addressed. The length of the CE is directly related to taking time to find out important information about family well-being, including potential DV.
Yes, and I thought I did mention that with the CE, that it is very long, but the whole point is to get at information that could be beneficial and address those barriers that the parent might be facing, so that you can reflect that in the IRP. So it's really helpful. It can be really helpful, but I also want to note that those of you who are going into people's homes and working with families, you might be hearing people, they might talk about it, or they might complain about it, or they might say, like, oh God, it took so long, I didn't even finish it. And that's why it is a lengthy process, but it's in order to hopefully get folks to disclose about certain issues so that they can offer resources. Yes, anything else? Any other questions so far? Okay, so the possible referral, so that's the screening. So referring, the CSO staff can refer internally. Many of the CSOs have a DV advocate contracted to be on site for a certain amount of hours each week. Not all of them, but many of them. And so I think that would be a great resource for you to find out if your local community has a DV advocate in the CSO or not, because that'll give you information about, how to talk to the folks that you're working with. You can say, there's an advocate at the CSO, but they don't work for DSHS. You can talk to them. They work for this local program, blah, blah, blah. It can be a great way to make sure that folks understand that there are resources out there. Because even when, like I said, when we're talking about context, when we're talking about survivors going to the CSO, they're there to get their TANF check. Even when folks are using that context paragraph and workers are talking about why it would be beneficial to disclose, survivors still don't disclose. So you might be in a position to know that there's domestic violence happening with a family who's on TANF, and be able to say, oh wait, did you know that you can have you can tweak your IRP to make more sense for you and this domestic violence situation you're dealing with? Did you know that there is a DV advocate on site, or there's this local program in the community who can help you think about that and talk about that? That can be really handy. And then also internally, there are social workers, social service specialists in the CSOs that can also talk about and work with somebody who's experiencing domestic violence if there's not a DV advocate. Or even if there is a DV advocate, sometimes people don't want to talk to the DV advocate, and that's fine. There's social service specialists. And then externally, your local DV program. If you don't know your local DV program, we'll have a slide at the end to show you how to find out where your local program is and who your local program is. They're great to know. Good to know who that is. Get to know an advocate that works there, and be able to talk to the families that you're meeting with about the services that they offer. But those local resources, those local DV programs often, offer things like shelter, of course, but so much more than that. They offer support and advocacy and emotional support groups. They offer legal advocacy, which is, I know, a lot of survivors access. It's not legal representation, but it does help a survivor navigate the legal system. They some of the programs offer programs for children or teens, which is really great. Some of them have other housing programs besides shelter, like transitional housing or housing for domestic violence housing first. There's lots of different services that these local DV programs offer. It's great to find out who your local program is, what your local program is, and what they do. And we'll talk about exactly how to do that if you don't already know at the end. Is there a question?
Is there a list of DV advocates in the local offices?
There is a list of DV advocates in the local offices that I keep. It's a little bit out of date, but maybe what I can do is get that up to date, and I could get it to Lee. Is that something you can send out to your people? All right, so Lee will be able to send that out to folks as well who are on this list, or if you're interested, you can contact us, and that's something that I can, that I can share. Absolutely, good question. Any other questions? Not yet? Okay, great. Moving on. All right, so we talked about screening, we talked about referral, and the third thing about the family violence option is waiving requirements. So, according to the Workforce Handbook, and there's the chapter, if a requirement would make it more difficult to escape family violence, unfairly penalize victims of family violence, or place them at further risk of family violence, these are some of the things you can do. Waive time limits, waive child support enforcement, and the last one is refer individuals to social services, counseling, and supportive services. So that's like the advocate or the local DV program in lieu of work or job search activities. So if somebody is experiencing domestic violence currently and is dealing with the all of the things that come along with that, they're having to go to court, or they're just really trying to maintain their safety. They're maybe being stalked. They're trying to, or they fled and they're trying to get their kids settled into a new school and them settled into a community. They have they're dealing with all of the emotional issues that come along with that, and they want to go to one-on-one advocacy counseling and support groups from the local program. Those things can be put on IRPs. If those are the things that they're doing, especially if they're doing those anyway, or they want to start doing those, all of that takes a lot of time. Something I talk about when I do trainings for the staff, the CSO staff and the workforce staff, is that domestic violence, takes over your life, and it takes an enormous amount of time to get through and to get safe and to get stable. And that's why we have these waivers, right? That's why we waive time limits, because somebody can be on TANF for 5 years easy, and off and on for to like culminate into 5 total years, and still be dealing with the aftermath. Even if they're safe, they might still be dealing with the emotional issues. They're still dealing with the economic issues of not being allowed maybe to go to school or work or have a job, and having to start over in that department. And those after effects, all of that takes a lot of time. And then sometimes the abuse comes back. Sometimes the abuser finds them if they've fled and they, were trying to stay hidden. And then it starts all over again for that survivor. So it just takes a long time. And that's why these waivers are here. That's why we have the federal law. That's why we have these policies. That's why they have the policies at the CSO. And so that's why you can really tweak the IRP. The worker can tweak that IRP to really work for a survivor. They can waive, all of job search and work activities and just have like maybe mental health and domestic violence activities on their IRP. Like they can do that if that makes sense for that individual. They can do part-time job search or work activities and part-time domestic violence related activities, support group, counseling, whatnot. So whatever works for the individual, they can make that happen on the IRP. And then if something changes in the survivor's life, they can go back and tweak that IRP. If they were doing work and job search and they just had a maybe support group on their IRP and that was it, but then they were found by their abuser, or something, or they got into a new domestic violence situation and things have escalated, and job search or work doesn't make sense for what they need right now to deal with that domestic violence situation, then they can go back to their worker at the CSO and say, hey, this is happening for me now. Can we make the IRP work? Because I can't, I'm not able to make it to job search because I'm being stalked now when I wasn't before. Those sorts of things can be pretty flexible. All right. Then that's what I just talked about. The tailoring of the individual responsibility plans. DV-related services count towards participation requirements, and survivors can use workforce time to address domestic violence barriers. Hang on, I think we are almost to question. Oh, we'll go back. Well, we won't go back. But yeah. Is there a question? Yes, go for it.
Does the victim need to name their abuser to be eligible to qualify for the waivers?
Oh, good question. Does the victim need to name their abuser? No. Absolutely not. They do not need to name their abuser in order to qualify.
Have there ever been individuals who say they're in a DV situation just to receive services?
That's a good question. I think I don't know the answer for sure. I can imagine that there's always one, somebody out there who says something, in order to access, and I mean, people are savvy and try and work the system. It's not at all the vast majority. The reality is it's very difficult for survivors to even disclose domestic violence. So sometimes it even takes a long time for somebody at the CSO to figure out that that's what's going on. Even when they do the CE and they ask those questions up front, you know, folks don't disclose. And so there is not, when you look at data on who is accessing the waivers on, you know, for it's called, in their term, it's called an XF component. That's what they put in when they are dealing with, when they have domestic violence activities on their IRP. It's actually a very small, it's a very small proportion of the TANF caseload. So the data suggests that people are not willy-nilly, like, just lying about their situations to access these protections. Because it's not, I mean, they have to participate in support group and dealing with legal issues and dealing with housing issues. I mean, like, they have to participate in all the things that they put on there. And it doesn't make sense for someone who's not dealing with domestic violence to participate. So oftentimes, if that is the case, then they just won't participate and get sanctioned. And there's a process that, you know, that in place to address that sort of a thing. But I would say no, the vast majority of folks who disclose domestic violence are truly experiencing domestic violence. But, yeah, more questions?
2 more. What happens to the waiver if the client is referred in lieu of work job search requirement but doesn't follow up on the referral? And part 2, what if the survivor has also been arrested during family violence?
Okay. Well, the arrest doesn't matter in terms of accessing the protections at DSHS. I mean, unless there's something that would prevent, unless the arrest led to something in the courts that would prevent them from being eligible for TANF, that's a different thing. But if they're eligible for TANF, then their arrest record doesn't matter in terms of accessing the protections. We know, and advocates who are working in the CSOs understand that oftentimes survivors use violence, that the wrong person gets arrested or the right person gets arrested under the law because they're the ones that use the violence, but really they're not the one that are being systematically, they're the ones being systematically controlled. So that the arrest thing should not matter. So if someone's saying, well, you've been arrested, you know, again, I would connect with an advocate who's at the CSO. If there's not an advocate at your CSO, get your local program involved, an advocate to help advocate with the worker on that situation. Or call me, I'm happy to help with stuff like that, absolutely. But the other, what was the other question was?
If the client was referred in lieu of work job search requirement, right, but doesn't follow up on the referral.
Right. So that happens all the time. What they do is, you know, they'll get called in to say, hey, you didn't participate in the thing that you said you were going to do. You didn't follow up. What's going on? If they come back into I mean, I think the best advice to give families that you're working with who are on TANF is respond to your letters and your phone calls from your CSO staff person. Like, respond to them, because they're going to call or send letters and say, hey, it looks like you're not participating. Looks like you didn't follow through with this thing you said you were going to do. What's going on? And if they respond and say, well, you know, I couldn't, or I'm not sure about it, or whatever the reason is, right? But if they respond, they can then have a conversation about how to proceed with their worker, and they can hopefully reduce the risk of sanction, especially if they're a survivor and the reason they weren't able to respond was because of the violence, was because their abuser hid the keys and they weren't able to make the appointment, because, you know, all of those things. If that's why they weren't able to respond, then, you know, there are protections in place. They're not going to get immediately cut off of TANF, hopefully, if that's the reason, if domestic violence was the reason that they weren't able to participate. Now, if the reason was that they're just nervous or they don't think it's the right thing or whatnot, it's still a good idea to talk to your worker, because having a conversation means that that worker has some information. The worker is going to make a decision. The program specialist or the social worker at the CSO, they're going to make a decision based on the information they have. If they don't hear from the parent, then they're going to have to make a decision on whether to sanction or not based on what they've gotten. If they're not participating, they're going to sanction, which means that they'll get their benefits significantly reduced. And then there'll be a particular amount of time that they have to cure that sanction. We'll talk about, I have some slides about sanction in a minute. If anybody's getting confused about that, we'll address that in a minute. But I think it's just a great, that's a great question because folks don't follow up sometimes. There's a lot of reasons why they might not be following through. And the best thing is to talk to the worker, because what's going to happen is that worker is going to contact them somehow and say, hey, what's going on? You didn't address, you didn't do what you said you were going to do. Does that answer that question? If it didn't, write me a follow-up question and we'll get to it in just a second. All right, are we good, Lee? Any more? Okay, moving on. So I want to talk a little bit about the infant exemption, because I think a lot of you are probably working with families who have very small children, and it's important to think about, especially if you're working with a family who's both has a small child and on TANF and is dealing with domestic violence. You know, the infant exemption is something they can access, and it's up to 12 months in a lifetime per parent. So they can voluntarily participate in Work First activities, like have activities on their IRP, but they're not required to, unless there's a couple of exceptions to that, because if they take the CE and it reveals mental health or chemical dependency issues, there might be some issues there where they would be required to participate in some of Work First activities that address those barriers. But generally, if you've got a child under 12 months, then you can access this infant exemption, where you wouldn't have activities that you have to participate in for up to 12 months. And that's in a lifetime. So you could take 3 months with one kid and 3 months with another kid, but it's a total of 12 months in a lifetime per parent. So why this maybe matters when you're thinking about domestic violence is if the parent is approaching their 12 months and dealing with a controlling partner, you can let them know that they can talk to their Work First worker about including activities related to domestic violence on their IRP, instead of having to jump right into full-time job search after that 12-month exemption. So if that's something that, because we want to set people up for success, right? And if they are dealing with issues of family violence, it's oftentimes really hard to jump right into full-time job search and not have time to deal with all the things that come along with domestic violence situations, like court and housing issues and all the emotional stuff as well. So it's a good reminder for folks, if they're approaching their 12 months and you know that they're dealing with a controlling partner, mention to them that there are protections and waivers available to them, potentially available to them at the CSO. All right, now we have an official questions and comments section. Anybody? Yes.
What do you mean by per parent for the IE? Can a father take it as well for the infant exemption? Can a father take it as well? I
believe so. I'm not an expert on the infant exemption, but Tom Berry is on the line, and if he wants to write in an answer to that, he works in the policy department at CSD headquarters, so he might know the answer to that better than I do right off the top of my head. But I believe if there's, if it's a two-parent assistance unit, or there's two parents on TANF on the same case together, I believe it can be for each parent. But we'll see what Tom says. Are there other questions? No other questions right now?
Oh, wait. Oh. Yep. If a client was to waive child support enforcement, are they penalized financially?
We have a whole section about child support, so I'm going to hold that thought, and if I don't get to it, or if I don't fully answer that question in the child support section, let me know. Yep.
This is Miranda, just in case Tom is not able to answer. yes, a father can take it. However, only one parent can take it at one time if it is a two-parent household.
Gotcha. So yes, so that is correct. If it's a two-parent household on the same TANF case, then each parent gets the 12-month infant exemption, but only one parent can take it at a time. So if one parent, so if you have, there's an infant and one parent takes the full 12 months until that child is a year, but then they have another baby, then the other parent could take 12 months and then they're done. So 12 months each parent if it's a two-parent household on the case. Okay, thank you, Miranda. All right. Any other questions, comments? Nope. Nope. All right. Moving on. Oh, let's see, I'm trying to think. We had a video that I wanted to show. You know what? I might come back to it at the end if we do end up having time. I think it's a great video that shows sort of the intersections of all the systems that survivors are dealing with and, helps put us into a framework of how to think about working with survivors, not just about the domestic violence that they're dealing with, but like all of the different things that they're dealing with. But y'all have some great questions, and I want to continue. Like I said, I've saved the child support and time limit extension and sanction stuff to the end. So I want to make sure we have enough time to deal with all of that and get everybody's questions in. So if we have time, I'll come back to the video.
Sorry, Tracy.
Yep.
One question just came in. I have a client who does not have underage children who has been wrongfully charged with domestic violence. Would she be able to receive this assistance?
Well, all of this assistance that I'm talking about is for folks who are eligible for TANF. So if somebody does not have children that are dependents, then they're not eligible for TANF. So no, this is really just for the TANF program and folks who are eligible for TANF. All right, good question. Now, confidentiality. I want to talk a little bit about confidentiality. I mentioned it when we talked about the context paragraph for the domestic violence questions that precede the domestic violence questions in the comprehensive evaluation. But I want to say, obviously confidentiality is vital for survivors. DSHS has detailed confidentiality practices that are designed to both protect privacy of clients as well as to allow for coordination of services. So what that means is, it's not sort of a, doctor-patient, lawyer-client kind of privilege thing when you're talking to your worker. And a lot of survivors, we did, several years ago, we here at the Coalition did focus groups with survivors who are on TANF. We asked them about confidentiality specifically, and so many of them said something we just saw consistently in those interviews was that folks, when you said the word confidentiality to them or said, we keep your information confidential, their interpretation was just that, was that sort of lawyer, client, doctor, patient kind of privilege. So that's not what is at DSHS, and that's because they work with a lot of different people at the CSO. Oftentimes they're working with maybe a financial worker and then a workforce program specialist and then a social services specialist. Those folks have to be able to communicate. And then they also work with so many community partners, community jobs, WorkSource, the DV advocates, they work with so many different people. And so that their confidentiality rules allow them to share information if it's for the coordination of services with all those different folks. It's just important. So that's just a kind of a nugget of information that survivors don't, I think, by and large understand, and could be handy for someone who is making a decision about what to disclose, how much to disclose to their DSHS worker, what if to disclose, and if they have concerns about that, to be able to talk about that and say, hey, are there ways to protect this a little bit more because I'm concerned about who might actually be able to see this. So that's confidentiality at the CSO. DV advocates follow different policies about confidentiality. We do have privileged communication where it is like one-on-one. What the survivor tells the advocate is the advocate's to hold unless the survivor gives express permission to share that information with somebody else. We have very strict policies about that. And this is even true when there's a DV advocate that works on site at the CSO. So that's good to remember. If you're working with folks, they're nervous about disclosing with their worker right away, but might be into talking to an advocate to see if there might be a reason to disclose to their worker. If they're nervous about that, that's a good thing to know, is that the DV advocate's confidentiality is different than the confidentiality at the CSO. But this can cause frustration in communication when there's not a clear understanding about that. And for y'all too, if you're working with with DV advocates and trying to get it, you know, and if you feel like it would be beneficial if they could share information, but they can't, that can be frustrating. But it's just good to know they can't. They can't share information unless they have express permission written on a release of information that they have signed that says you can share this piece of my story with this person. I signed it and said so. So that's what the DV advocates, that's how the DV advocates work with that on confidentiality. Are there any questions about confidentiality before we go to child support? Yep.
We kind of wanted to follow up, Tracy, on that one question where the participant asked if they didn't have underage children, were they eligible for TANF? So they're not eligible for TANF, but we just wanted to emphasize that a client with no kids or a client with kids who's been arrested on a domestic violence charge, you can always work with your local domestic violence advocate. We want to make sure that's clear to help with that case.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I did not mean to dismiss that, that there's no help for that person, because there is help for that person, just not through the TANF program, not specifically the things I'm talking about today, but they would absolutely be able to find some support and help at their local DV program. Thanks, Lee. Okay, did any questions come up about confidentiality? Okay. Child support. We had some questions about this. Okay, I think the number one thing to understand about child support and TANF is that opening a TANF case automatically opens a child support case. Opening a TANF case automatically opens a child support case. So if you didn't already know that, that's key to know, especially for survivors. Because here's the thing, you know, domestic violence survivors might be reluctant to pursue child support for safety reasons, right? Interacting with somebody who's, you know, this can open a whole other can of worms for that person if they're trying to stay safe, if they've enacted a safety plan, if they minimize their contact with this person and then end up having to go on TANF, then and the other parent who happens to be the abuser then gets a summons, you know, or a letter from child support. That can be a safety risk. So, you know, I definitely again encourage you to have relationships with your local advocates and help parents connect with them if they're dealing with this kind of a thing, because advocates can help survivors assess the safety risks of pursuing child support, and survivors can request a waiver for child support enforcement if they're on TANF, and we'll talk more about that now. So here's the pros and cons of child support. This is why it's something that it's great to talk through with for a survivor to talk through with an advocate, because there are pros. Right? Well, we know that when there's a steady income stream, even a small one, like child support, families are less likely to even access public benefits. And for a low-income custodial parent, that's the parent that has the child most of the time, child support can be a hefty proportion of their monthly income. And the other thing is survivors want the other parent to share financial responsibility. Oftentimes they do. They're like, listen, yes, we have our issues. Yes, it's you know, we are in a terrible situation, but the reality remains that he's responsible as much as I am financially for this child that we share, and I want the other parent to be responsible. So that's some of the things around why a survivor might want to access child support. The cons, though, is that going after child support can be a huge safety risk for many survivors. That's something that is just the reality. Like I mentioned, it can escalate the violence in a relationship because it can open that can of worms that hasn't been opened before. It can, oftentimes survivors report that once child support gets involved, the threats of gaining custody or, and taking the child away from the custodial parent ramp up by the abuser, which is terrifying. It's emotional manipulation and also real, because I've known cases where abusers have worked the legal system in order to get custody of their kids and do that very thing. And so it's terrifying. And it can also reveal the whereabouts of a survivor who's trying to stay hidden. So if somebody has fled from another state, opening TANF in Washington state, if they don't ask for that waiver right away, will immediately notify the other parent / abuser that they're in Washington state. So it can be a huge safety risk. That said, a survivor can request good cause to not cooperate with child support. So this can happen when she applies for TANF or at any point after that. She can claim good cause. To do this, a survivor has to fill out a form. It's the 18334, if we want to get technical, but it's a form. And she has to write and sign a statement outlining her fears and concerns about pursuing child support. That's it. If she can write a statement that clearly outlines her fears and concerns about why pursuing child support would be a terrible idea, and signs it, that should be enough. That should be enough for a worker to be able to grant good cause. The folks at the CSO aren't expected to investigate these claims. That's something that they used to have to do. It has been taken out of their social services manual and the handbook as far as any references to investigating. And this is the language. DSHS cannot require a parent to provide court orders or police reports in order to support a cause of good claim. There are many reasons why a victim of family violence would not be in possession of these. For example, if she has fled and left the papers behind, or is seeking copies of these documents, or if seeking copies of these documents would alert the perpetrator to his or her whereabouts. In addition, many victims, for a variety of good reasons, have never sought help from systems like the police, courts, or medical facilities. So what that is basically saying is that this signed statement should be enough, and that folks can offer other things like protection orders or a letter from their advocate or a letter from their clergy person, but they should not have, like, that is just extra. If all they want to do is clearly outline their fears and concerns and sign that statement, that should be enough to grant good cause. So yeah, that's what I just said. That's the bottom line. And that is from the Social Services Manual, what I just read you, and then on this one as well. It says additional documents, statements, and other types of verification that have been gathered that support the parents and caretakers' good cause request. Even without other documentation, you must accept a sworn statement in support of the good cause claim. All right. Questions?
So I had a clarification from Tom that you might want to comment on.
Yes.
He says DSHS confidentiality practice includes protected domestic violence case notes that prevents non-DSHS staff, i.e. other state agencies, from viewing this information.
That is true. There is a protected screen for domestic violence case notes in their system, and that is great. And that is something that does happen. However, it doesn't prevent other DSHS staff, like Tom said, from seeing it. And so if the concern is that they have someone who, if the abuser's mom or brother or whoever, somebody close, if he has connections with someone who works at a CSO, then there still might be a concern that they could access those protected records as well. But it is a nice extra layer of protection that contracted workers cannot see. So that is great. Thank you, Tom, for the clarification.
So basically, it only really prevents non-DSHS staff from viewing it.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Any questions about either confidentiality or child support? Nothing? Oh, yeah, hang on, let's see, what was the question about child support that we had before? Let me look. Lee, if you find it before I do, let me know.
If a client was to waive child support enforcement, are they penalized financially.
Are they penalized financially? No, no. So it does not reduce the grant that they get. There used to be a thing called child support pass-through, that if you did access child support, you got a little bonus up to $100 for one kid or $200 if you had two kids, depending on how much the Division of Child Support actually collected from that that non-custodial parent. So you would get as much as, you know, if they were only collecting $25 from him, then that's all you would get. But it was called pass-through. And unfortunately, that's not available anymore. I don't know if it'll ever come back, but, you know, I have high hopes and cross fingers that maybe one day it'll come back, because I think it's a great incentive for folks to, I mean, it's great for, you know, folks to have that extra money in their pocket for sure. And money can equal safety for survivors in a lot of ways. So when it's safe to pursue, that's something that's there. But that doesn't exist anymore, and so asking for a waiver for not collecting child support does not affect their TANF grant, and never did. Like that, the bottom line TANF grant, like that, it does not affect the amount that they get there. Any other questions? Nope. All righty. Well, we might have time for the video after all. Well, maybe not. 5-year time limit. So you, so there is a. Oh,
I just got a question.
Just a question. Okay,
sorry.
we'll go back.
Where do you find the form to outline your fears and concerns? I have a client that is getting her TANF cut off next month if she does not disclose FOB, but is now very concerned about ramifications of disclosing. Where should she start?
Well, I think that she should probably start with the advocate at the CSO if she has one. I don't know what you know, area of the state you're in, but if the parent's local CSO has an advocate, I would try and find that out and get her connected to the advocate, and that advocate can help her navigate all of those questions you were just talking about. But the form can be found on the DSHS website as well. I don't know exactly where it is. I usually just search for it in the search box, dshs.wa.gov. It can be found there, but I think most importantly, get her connected to an advocate either in her local program or at the CSO, or you can contact me about that specifically. If she doesn't have an advocate, a DV advocate contracted to work in her CSO, I'm also happy to help. Yeah, do you want to put my Lee will.
I will do that right now.
Lee will put my contact information in the question.
Another question.
Yep.
Does a client have to reapply each year for good cause?
So good cause is reviewed every 6 months at least, I believe. So you don't have to reapply necessarily, not in the same way that you apply in the first place, but it will be reviewed, and you'll have to have a conversation with your worker about it. They'll say, hey, is this still apply? Is this still going on? Is anything changed? Do you want to change this? Yeah, so it is evaluated at least every 6 months. Yep, all right, that's all the questions. Okay, moving on. Okay, so the 5-year time limit. So there is now there has been for a while, a 60-month time limit on TANF, but just in the last like 3 years or so, Washington State has had to implement it. Before, you know, there was state money that picked up after the 5 years wore off, but, you know, the economy crashed and the budgets crashed, and here we are. So there is a 60-month lifetime limit on TANF. There are exemptions for this for several different issues, and domestic violence is one of them. So if a survivor, so basically what a survivor must do to get a 5-year, a family violence time limit extension, they have to disclose domestic violence to their worker. It can be current or past. It does not have to be, they do not have to be in immediate danger, and that's something that I talk about when I train the workers at the CSOs, and it's something that there has been some confusion about in the past. So it's good to know that the domestic violence does not have to be current and they do not have to be in immediate danger in order to access a family violence time limit extension. It goes along with the family violence option that allows for not unfairly penalizing someone who's experienced DV. We know it takes a long time to get safe and secure and stable after you've experienced domestic violence, and this exemption recognizes that. So disclose DV to the worker, ask for an exemption, and then in order to do that, what they'll do is usually go to see the advocate if there's an on-site advocate, or a social service specialist if there's not an on-site advocate, to create something called a family violence service plan. And that service plan is just it's a short document that helps the CSO worker, the Work First program specialist, or the social services specialist create domestic violence activities in the IRP. So they have to get a family violence service plan which informs what kind of domestic violence activities will be included on the IRP. And that can be tricky for folks who have experienced domestic violence in the past, but most of the time folks, will at least identify that working with an advocate or doing support group once a week would still be beneficial, and that's something that they can put as an activity on their IRP. They do not have to fill up all the hours on their IRP with domestic violence activities in order to be eligible for this exemption. They can, there has to be something on the IRP that is domestic violence related in order to, and they have to continue to participate. That's the other thing. They, the second that they don't participate, then they'll be called into sanction, and they'll be cut off. I mean, if domestic violence wasn't the reason why they weren't participating, then they'll be cut off, and at their 60-month time limit, they'll be done. No sanction, just done, cut off. So that's something that folks need to know, is like, if they want the exemption, they have to participate in everything that's on their IRP, but especially the DV activity, because that's the thing that's part of this policy around who's eligible for the the family violence time limit extension. There are questions about the 5-year time limit?
I'm sorry, Maria Jensen has had her hand up for a long time.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Did you see her? No, I missed it.
I missed it.
My fault, Maria.
All right, let me unmute Maria. Or Marie, sorry. Marie.
Thank you.
You are unmuted. Oh.
Is she still there?
Okay, I can't unmute you, Marie, but I did send a code because you're on the phone. So if you put in that PIN number, we should be able to hear you. I'll wait for a moment because I can't unmute you until you enter that PIN. All right, we'll come back to you, Marie, I promise. So sorry about that. All right, any questions about the time limit extension? Let's see. I don't see any. I just want to give people a chance. All right, anything, Lee?
I'm sending another message.
All right. All right, I will move on, but if you have your questions about the 5-year time limit, enter those and we will get to them.
Here's one more.
Oh, all right.
Another person. Not sure how to ask this question. We have parents who have experienced domestic violence and are developmentally delayed, who could potentially qualify for SSI. How does this interact with TANF?
Well, if they are if they are eligible for TANF, if they are parenting, then these protections would certainly be available to them. All the stuff that I'm talking about today would be, would be potentially available. If they aren't on TANF, then it's not something that would be eligible. And SSI is just a completely different program. So if they were able to get on SSI, then they wouldn't need most of these protections because that's something that doesn't have a time limit, and they wouldn't be required to participate in certain activities. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question 100%, but let me know if you have a follow-up question. Are there any others?
Nope, and nothing from Marie.
Okay, yeah, all right. Let me see, I'm gonna look and see if I can unmute Marie now. Nope, I still can't.
Do you want to do the video?
Sorry, all right. So we're gonna move on. We've got sanction. So I wanted to talk about sanction. Sanction is when somebody's not participating on their IRP, the activities on their IRP. They'll get a letter from their worker saying, please come in so we can talk about why you haven't been participating. And if you don't come in, then you can come in at this day and time. And if you don't come in at this day and time, we're going to come to your house at this day and time. I'll talk about that in just a second. But if they don't come in and they aren't at their home for that visit, then the worker, again, this is why I was saying earlier, when you don't communicate with your worker, the worker makes decisions based on what they got. And so oftentimes that decision will be to sanction if they're not participating and they haven't heard from that person. And sanctioning means a significant reduction in their grant immediately. And if they come back in to re-engage and talk about why they weren't participating, then they can move on from there. And there's two different ways that might happen for someone who's a survivor of domestic violence. So once they come back in, if they've been sanctioned, or if they come in before the sanction and they come in for that case staffing, that meeting before a sanction decision has been made, the worker is going to try and figure out if domestic violence is the thing that prevented the parent from participating. If domestic violence, if the abuse, the manipulation, the things that abusers do, like prevent you from going places, if you weren't able to show up for, job search or a work site because you were, dealing with getting medical attention because of an assault, anything like that. If domestic violence is the thing that prevented the parent from not participating, then they don't sanction, or they lift the sanction immediately. They don't, and the grant is restored at the beginning of the next month. They don't have to do this thing called a cure. And they renegotiate the IRP that supports the person in coping with the family violence while also working towards goals of work first. So they change the IRP to make it work for them, because obviously it wasn't working before, and they don't sanction. If domestic violence wasn't the thing, even if that person is a survivor, if they decide that the domestic violence wasn't the thing that was preventing the parent from participating, then they go through the regular sanction and cure process. So they get sanctioned, and so they get that grant reduction, and then they have 4 weeks to cure. So they have to participate for 4 weeks in a row before their grant will be restored. And I'll take questions on that in a second, but I want to talk a little bit more about sanction. So there's a new rule around sanction, and this is where these sanction visits have come into play. This is why they're doing these, because the time someone has to cure their sanction has been shortened from 4 months to 2 months. So before, you had 4 months to participate for 4 weeks. So you had 4 months where anytime during that 4 months, if you participated for 4 weeks in a row, then your grant can be restored. That was your cure. I'm doing air quotes for the cure. But now you have 2 months to participate for 4 weeks, much shorter. And that's hard for survivors, because like we know, survivors are, now hopefully if domestic violence was the reason why they weren't able to participate, then they won't have to deal with sanction. But sometimes they do have to deal with sanction, and it's difficult to be able to participate for those 4 weeks within 2 months if they're dealing with abuse as well. So it's just something to keep in mind. When they're found to be in non-compliance, they'll get a letter, and I mentioned this, stating a time to meet at the CSO and another time that they will show up, that the worker will show up at their home. So these are the sanctioned visits that I referred to before. And these are happening. Most of the time, from what I hear when I do trainings around the state with the folks that are doing these visits, most of the time parents are not at home when the work first staff pays a visit. So I'm just going to tell you what I talk to the work first staff about, the tips that I give regarding domestic violence, like folks that might be experiencing domestic violence and going into somebody's home. You know, they receive another kinds of training on, you know, going into people's homes, and that's not my area of expertise necessarily, but we are asking folks, you know, letting folks know DV might be one of the things to be aware of. And if a client is dealing with domestic violence, just simply their presence in the home could impact her situation. We let them know that most of the time it's the survivor who will be at most risk, not the visitor, but just to be aware. And the thing that we're pushing is to bring materials and know their local resources. So we're asking folks who are going in to do these sanctioned visits to bring something that talks about local resources for their domestic violence agency, something. You know, we let them know they may or may not be able to leave it there, because if it's not safe, that's not something, but they might be able to scroll down an unlabeled number, you know, on the back page of their IRP that they've printed out and brought, or whatever. Like, there might be a way to get that info, and it's good to have it and bring it, because you never know what you're going to get, you know, when you enter somebody's home, for sure. I know that y'all know all about that stuff. So that is what we're talking about with folks who are doing these sanctioned visits. Are there questions, comments?
So, okay. Okay, so this is 2 comments from Tom Berry. One's back. If the TANF parent is disabled enough to apply for SSI, they can be exempt from work requirements and time limits while they apply for SSI.
Okay, so if they are eligible for TANF and are trying to go for SSI, then they can be exempt from workforce requirements. That's great to know. Thank you, Tom.
And then Tom also says, another thing to keep in mind, if a parent gets child support, if the child support is greater than the TANF grant for 2 consecutive months, the TANF grant shuts down.
Yes, that's another thing about child support generally. If the Division of Child Support can collect more per month than what they would be getting on TANF, then you don't get TANF anymore, you get child support. You get that child support, which could be great if it's safe, and not so great if it's not. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Good tip. Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
That's all we got right now.
That's it. Well,
do we have time for Rachel?
We don't have time for Rachel, unfortunately. We only have 2 it's like 5 minutes long. Okay. Yeah, we don't have time, because then, you know, we don't have time to watch it and then talk about it, which is a bummer. But we got a couple more things too. Administrative hearings, I wanted to mention. So if you're receiving welfare, people receiving, you know, on TANF can request an administrative hearing if they disagree with the decision. And this is an administrative hearing would be a hearing with a neutral party, so it's not somebody within the CSO. This request can be made in person by the person receiving the benefits. It has to be made by the person receiving the benefits to their caseworker. So an advocate or y'all we can't make that request for someone. The person receiving the benefits has to make the request for an administrative hearing. In writing is best, because, you know, in writing is always best. You can document it, but a verbal request should be acceptable. Even if somebody doesn't write it down but says, hey, I'm requesting an administrative hearing, the CSO worker should, like, once requested, whether or not it's in writing or verbal, the administrative hearing process should begin, and the request should be honored. So that's something that if there's a decision that, you know, you're working with somebody and you're like, that seems weird. I learned this thing in this webinar I was in that makes me think that I don't know if that's right. You know, you can, and if the survivor doesn't feel like she's getting anywhere with the CSO, she can request an administrative hearing. Oftentimes the administrative hearings don't even happen, because once it's requested and it goes to that level, people, different people pay attention to it, and it can often get resolved before even going through the actual hearing process. But if it doesn't, then it can go through that hearing process, and a decision can be made in that way. But it's a great tool to use if you feel like somebody hasn't gotten what they needed.
And advocates are used to helping with these?
Yes, advocates are used to talk. I mean, like, advocates can talk to survivors about what these are. Sometimes advocates can go with that person to the hearing if it goes that far. So it's good to, connect with them. But, even you can just talk to somebody, talk to a parent if you're working with a parent and they're telling you about something that happened with their TANF situation, and you're like, that doesn't seem like it might be right. Then you can mention to them that they have the right to request an administrative hearing for a decision. All right, and then local resources. Like I said, many CSOs have on-site DV advocates, but it's just great to know if your CSO has a DV advocate, and even if they do, who's your local program? Do you have more than one local program? You might, depending on what part of the state you're in. So these are a couple of links that I have here on our website, on the Coalition's website. We have a list of member programs by county. Can also be really handy if you're working with somebody who is in the process of getting out of Dodge, right? They are fleeing. And you're like, well, I know my local program, but I have no idea what the local program is in Kennewick, right? Well, you can find that here and help them connect with somebody in the place that they may be going to. And the next link I have is our Get Help Now page. It helps survivors or you understand what happens when you call a shelter or call a local program and talk to an advocate. Because sometimes people just don't want to, because they're like, I feel so uncomfortable. I don't even know what to expect. I don't know what to expect when you go to a shelter. I don't know what to expect when I talk to a DV program. And this page just outlines what that is. And that's it. So I kept you 2 minutes over. I'm so sorry. There's an evaluation that'll pop up when we close out of this webinar. Please take a minute to let us know how we're doing. And thank you so much for being here and for participating. And please let me know if you have specific questions you want help with, or regarding domestic violence and TANF and anything like that. I'm happy to help. Do we have a final question?
One of these webinars that addresses DV and DCFS/CPS would be really helpful.
Oh, yes, that would be really helpful, wouldn't it? Thank you. Good. Thank you for that. Write that on your evaluation. Thanks so much.